If the altitude colors are the general levels of human emergence, the actual rungs or structures in the upper left developmental ladder, or the waves of unfolding from birth to enlightenment, how do individuals move through this spectrum? Who is it that is doing the movement? What properties govern that movement? How do we understand individual development in a cumulative and holistic way? And finally, how do we account for the variance seen in individual development? As we round out this lengthy learning path on levels, we will encounter these final topics: the scale of developmental investigation, the forms of development, the nature of transformation, and the developing self. To adequately answer these questions, we must first confront the question of scale. At what scale of investigation does this altitude spectrum appear? And at what scale do the properties we've discussed hold more or less true? Developmental research is conducted at 3 degrees of scale, and each degree reveals a noticeably different picture of development. First is the scale of microdevelopment, which models development and learning over minutes and hours. Next is the scale of mezzodevelopment, which models development over hours, weeks, and months. And finally, we have the scale of macrodevelopment, which models development over many months and years. So the simple question naturally arises: which scale does our current exploration of development concern? That's right. Each line and every spectrum we have discussed thus far was discovered through macro-developmental investigation, allowing us to see the unfolding of broad stages over many years. In this course, we will confine our investigation to this level because it provides you with the broadest, most cohesive picture of development. And it's the scale at which the principles and properties we've discussed actually hold up. In particular, it's the scale at which the altitude spectrum is most viable and easily recognized. In Course 2, we will venture into the other realms of scale to see how development looks and behaves differently at different scales. Regardless of which scale we're using, development is still development. It still concerns the increase in complexity of skill, behavior, and consciousness. What shifts at different scales is the subtle behaviors of the 3 forms of developmental movement: transformation, translation, and regression. In addition to 3 scales of developmental investigation, the integral approach also accounts for 3 types of developmental movement: transformation, translation, and regression. The following explanation concerns the nature of each form at the macro-developmental scale. Transformation refers the vertical movement upwards from lower to higher structures. Transformation is what we have spoken about most in the lesson. It refers, for example, to the movement from amber to orange, or from conventional to post-conventional. When we say vertical developmental transformation, we are referring to this type of movement through structures. Horizontal developmental transformation is typically used when referring to development in states, which we will learn about in the next lesson. Translation is also sometimes referred to as a horizontal movement, meaning rather than moving vertically between stages, we see a shuffling and stabilizing of various surface features within a current stage. Technically, translation refers to the way in which an individual coordinates and makes sense of the entire aqual matrix arising for them at given level of development. Additionally, the acquisition of knowledge could be viewed as a translative function. Just because someone is really smart in, say, theoretical physics doesn't mean, for example, that their self-sense is complexly developed. Someone whose self-sense is orange can acquire subject-specific knowledge in the same way someone whose self-sense is teal. As such, an increase in theoretical or cognitive knowledge is more of a translative than transformative function. Finally, our third movement is called regression, which refers to temporary or permanent movement from a higher level to a lower level. At the macro scale, regression to lower stages is rare, occurring in cases of, say, organic brain damage, where physiological structures supporting certain higher stage functions are impaired. However, at the micro and meso levels, as we are learning new capacities and navigating the emergent dimensions of higher structures, temporary regressions to lower capacities are very common. For the purposes of this course, we will confine ourselves to the macro level of development. And of most importance at that scale is the movement of transformation. So, what does transformation entail? We've seen that the content of each developmental structure is different, meaning, for example, that amber is quite different than green in all lines. But the nature of developmental transformation between all levels is essentially the same. At each point in development, we find this general sequence. 1. The self starts out identified with its current level of development. 2. A higher order level begins to emerge. 3. The self starts to shift identification from the current level to the new, more complex level. 4. The high order level continues to emerge as the self begins disidentifying or differentiating from the previous level. 5. The process continues until the self is fully differentiated from the lower level and identified with the higher level. 6. This completes the self's transcendence of the lower level. 7. At this point, the self is able to embrace or include the lower level's enduring capacities from the place of the higher level. 8. The self then integrates its functioning at the new level, including and coordinating all enduring capacities from all previous levels. This process can be stated in many ways, each of which tells us something very important about the pattern or nature of development, evolution, and transcendence. What is whole becomes part. What is identification becomes detachment. What is context becomes content. What is ground becomes figure. What is subject becomes object. What is condition becomes element. For example, at each point in development, what is whole at one level becomes part of a whole at the next level. Sensoromotor actions, during the early stages of growth, are the whole of the self-sense. As the pre-operational mind emerges and develops, however, the sense of identity shifts to the latter, or mind, and the former, or body-based actions, become merely one aspect, one part of the total self. You've probably noticed that our language has begun to shift from referring to you as the person developing to this new idea of a self who is developing. Another common feature of developmental transformation, regardless of who it is that's developing, is that the self is the navigator of development. At each transition between macro stages, the self navigates or negotiates what are called fulcrums. The concept of fulcrums summarizes the transformation process described earlier as a three-part or three-phase movement from identification to differentiation to integration. The self as navigator, when described in third-person terms, is called the self-system, and in first-person terms, it's called the self-sense. Put differently, we can look at and describe the self in systematic terms, or you can feel into yourself as it arises. The latter is literally your sense of self. From a systems perspective, the self is the locus of several important functions. First is identification with the skills, capacities, and thoughts of your current level, all of which you call I. Second is the function of will, or your ability to freely choose actions, thoughts, and beliefs within the conditions of the entire aqual matrix as it's arising for you in each moment. Third are your defenses, or the capacities of the self to protect and ensure its boundaries and identity from encroachment by others and the external environment. Fourth is called your metabolism, which refers to the way you metabolize and make sense of experiences as you build the structure or pattern of your developing self. Fifth is the function of integration, which is the way in which you balance, understand, and bring together the various levels, lines, states, and types arising as aspects of your being in all 4 quadrants. Next, from more of a first-person perspective, but still described in third-person language because that's what works when learning theory, your self-sense is made up of 3 aspects or components. Your proximate self, which is your subjective self experienced as an I, your distal self, or your objectified self, which is experienced as me or mine, and your interior self, which is your pure self, the self that witnesses the arising of all phenomena as ultimate awareness. This final component will be made clearer in the lesson on states. So, in summary, it is your self-sense or self-system, depending on the perspective you take, that navigates each fulcrum of development and serves as the locus of these 5 important functions. Another way of understanding the self is to metaphorically conceive of the self as the climber of the developmental ladder, who has a unique view from each rung. This is called ladder-climber view, and, as a metaphor, encapsulates the essence of your developing self. The ladder is the developmental sequence of enduring structures or waves unfolding with increasing complexity. Once these emerge, they remain in existence as the basic building blocks of the developing cosmos. The climber refers to the proximate self-system, or the navigator of this developmental ladder. Navigation between each rung flows through the 3 phases of a fulcrum: identification with the current rung, differentiation from the current rung as the next higher rung emerges, and finally, integration of enduring features of the previous rung from the place of the emergent rung. Finally, view refers to the changing and shifting view of the self at each rung. This includes a qualitatively different type of self-identity, needs, moral sense, cognition, and so on. As ontogenetic or individual development unfolds, the view from each rung of the ladder is negated, but the rung itself is not, in that you still maintain the included capacities from earlier rungs. Unless, of course, these structures are transitional as in the moral line. Once you develop conventional morality, you have no use for pre-conventional moral structures. However, you still possess sensoromotor capacities no matter how much you develop in the cognitive line. It is important to note that in either case, the exclusive view from previous levels are negated or not preserved. So, what happens when the climber makes a mistake while navigating a fulcrum? What happens if he or she slips on a rung of the developmental ladder? The result, as you'll see next, is a little thing called shadow. Although both shadow and fulcrum pathologies deserve detailed individual treatments, the aim of this course is to familiarize you with the core mechanisms underlying both topics. With that in mind, they'll be presented together. Before we dig into how shadow is generated in the process of vertical or structural development, let's first define shadow in very generic terms. Shadow forms when an aspect of the self which is deemed threatening or undesirable to the self-sense is pushed outside of the self's boundaries, which, in effect, renders it as disowned. This disowned part of the self may be negative or positive impulses, perceptions, emotions, experiences, or thoughts. Whatever it may be that you're rejecting, you are doing so because, on some level, you either consciously or unconsciously feel that this part of your self-experience is incompatible with your idealized self-image, desired sense of self, or your general worldview. The problem is that pushing these aspects away does not actually get rid of them, but simply converts them into painful neurotic symptoms, shadows that come back to haunt you. Then, everywhere you look, everyone you encounter is a potential canvas upon which you might unknowingly paint the subtle hues and contours of your disowned self's shadow. Come again? What is really going on here? Shadow forms when your first-person impulses, feelings, and qualities become repressed, disowned, or dissociated. Then, those very qualities start to appear as second-person or even third-person events in your first-person awareness. Consider this example. If I become angry at my boss, but that feeling of anger is a threat to my self-sense, I'm a nice person, nice people don't get angry, then I might dissociate or repress the anger. But simply denying the anger doesn't get rid of it. It merely makes the angry feelings appear alien in my own awareness. I might be feeling anger, but it is not my anger. The angry feelings are put on the other side of the self boundary. On the other side of the I boundary, that is. This sets up the possibility of projecting that anger from the first person, my anger, into the world, where it continues to arise not as mine but someone else's. Initially, this other is a second person. It is you who are angry, not me. However, if experiencing you as angry is still too threatening, still too close to home, then the dissociation continues and the anger is disowned even more. It gets pushed even further away from me and converted into a third-person entity or an it. In this final phase, I have lost touch with the anger. I am no longer experiencing anger, but instead, I am experiencing intense fear. I am afraid because the world looks hostile and dangerous and, well, really angry. This constitutes a truly hidden danger, an unknown hidden threat. When my anger was a second person, the perpetrator had a face. But now I am so out of touch with the original emotion that all I feel is anxiety, fear, or depression when faced with a world and a life that is unwelcoming to my existence. 2 final points before moving on. First, the same dynamic can happen when you disown positive qualities about yourself. They move from I to you to it, as you come to believe it is not me who is great or intelligent or sexy, but all those other people out there. Then, instead of being repulsed, you are strangely and neurotically drawn to them, obsessed with them. And once again you are drawn to what are really your disowned and then projected qualities. Second, we can reverse the movement from first to second to third, or 1, 2, 3, by doing what's called the 3-2-1 practice, which helps you to re-own your shadow as a first-person reality. Now we're going to turn up the heat a bit. Here you see 3 options. Each leads to a little sub-lesson on the pathologies which can occur as the self navigates the phases of each fulcrum. We encourage you to check them out, as a similar treatment of this topic can't be found elsewhere. But be warned, they are complex and lengthy treatments. After completing each section, you will be returned here, where you can click below to continue on to the next topic. Now, you might be wondering, what any of this has got to do with structural development? Well, the answer is as follows. For a variety of reasons, problems can occur while negotiating the 3 phases of any fulcrum. Each potential problem, each misstep that occurs while negotiating the steps between rungs of the ladder, can result in the generation of shadow symptoms. As a simple example, recall the section on the level line fallacy. Let's analyze the level line fallacy using the fulcrums. Again, the 3 fulcrum phases are identification, disidentification, and integration, and something can go wrong in each phase. If disidentification is perceived as being too threatening to the self's current identification, the self may become stuck or attached to the level that it's disidentifying from. In other words, the self can remain addicted to this particular level. Then, development can freeze at this level of the line in question, causing the entire line to then be associated with the specific level that the self is addicted to. This is the fixation side of the level line fallacy, and we will first be dealing with this part of the equation. The repression side of the level line fallacy will be dealt with in the section on the integration phase. A good example of this branch of the level line fallacy is individuals who are fixated on the amber level in the spiritual line. This results in a repression or pushing away of all the higher spiritual line potentials, because they threaten the self's identification. But this does not answer the question as to why someone would be addicted to or stuck on the amber level of the spiritual line, or to any level of any line for that matter. So what is really going on here? Every addiction has an unconscious, hidden, or shadow attachment, and this section will cover the unconscious attachment or hidden addiction associated with developmental arrest during the identification phase of the fulcrum. Here we aim to show how unconscious attachment contributes to developmental arrest and leads to the fixation side of the level line fallacy. This is the overall process. Vertical transformation requires disidentification, a form of death to the exclusive identification with the previous stage. The self begins identified to a stage. When the self is ready to begin disidentifying, the impulse to disidentify from its current identification often creates death anxiety. To curb this anxiety, the self represses and dissociates its healthy death and transcendence impulse. Because this impulse is repressed before it can be fulfilled, the self remains attached to it. However, the attachment is distorted into an unconscious one because the impulse has been exiled from the self or ownership boundary. Because this impulse has been repressed and projected, it becomes converted from a healthy first-person impulse into a second or third-person other, which now appears even more threatening. The self further dissociates what it now perceives as being an outside threat. However, this pushing away or dissociating further exacerbates the unconscious attachment that one has to the impulse for disidentification. The result is that the more the self denies this impulse, the more obsessed and addicted the unconscious attachment becomes to it, except now the impulse appears as a threatening other. The ironic consequence is that the more the self rejects its own death impulse, the more obsessed with the external threat of death it becomes. This creates further fear and anxiety, which means that the self feels more threatened and less willing to loosen its identification with the current level. Therefore, the self once again pushes away the impulse to disidentify, and the entire cycle begins again, further entrenching the self into its current phase of identification. Eventually, the only acceptable and non-threatening level of identification within the line or capacity that this event is taking place is perceived to be the level that the identification is arrested at. The self begins to associate the entire line or capacity with the level where developmental arrest occurred, resulting in a classic example of the fixation side of the level line fallacy. Fixation can also occur during the differentiation phase. Healthy development incorporates previous rungs into the new emergent level, but negates the views from the earlier levels. Rungs and capacities are incorporated, but views are negated. In some cases, although development continues, parts of the self remain fixated to a previous level. The result is that a hidden view or impulse is retained. Part of the self is secretly attached or addicted to an earlier way of being. The most severe symptoms of this hidden attachment manifest when the fixation or attachment is to the earliest levels of development. Fixation to a view from very early levels results in pathologies such as psychosis or the invasion of the rational mind by early pre-rational views and impulses. Another possibility is the formation of various personality disorders, depending on the level that has been poorly negotiated and the severity of the fixation. Milder forms of this kind of fixation result in neurotic symptoms, which are very common, and are also due to pre-rational views, needs, or sub-personalities hiding inside the rational or transrational self. Examples include, but are not limited to, superstitions, obsessive-compulsive disorders, food or sex addictions, and depression and anxiety disorders. So, once again, how does this addiction happen? How is it possible for parts of the self to remain addicted to a previous level? This happens in a similar fashion to what was presented in the previous section, but there is an additional detail, and this detail helps us answer how in the process of transformation, part of the self can remain addicted to or unconsciously attached to a previous level of being. Here is the detail. In healthy transcendence, the subject of one stage becomes the object of the subject of the next stage. In other words, if I am transcending my amber self, I am essentially making what was my I, or my amber self, into the me or mine of the orange I. For instance, when I develop into a formal operational level of cognition, what was once my concrete operational identification is transcended and becomes an object possessed by my now formal operational being. I was once confined to concrete operations, but now, from the formal operational level, I can still perform concrete operations without being exclusively confined to them. Jean Gebser stated it most accurately when he said that the self of one stage becomes the tool of the next stage. The main problem that can occur in the disidentification phase is that I cannot transcend anything that I don't already own. For instance, if I have never truly owned my amber anger, when I am disidentifying from amber, when I am transforming my amber self into an amber tool, possessed by my newly emerging orange self, my anger is not successfully transformed into an object that I possess, but instead, my disidentification from the amber level exacerbates the pre-existing disconnect between me and my amber anger. So instead of arising as my anger in the orange I, it arises as an other, an imposter or a stranger. Instead of arising as a first-person object that belongs to me, because it was never fully owned prior to the disidentification phase, when I do begin to disidentify from it, it is converted into a second person, or even a third-person object, not my amber rage, but yours or his or hers. This is when the process described in the earlier section takes effect. Disowning or disidentifying a part of myself creates a situation where I still continue to identify with it. But this time, the identification is unconscious. It is an unconscious attachment. In the case of my new orange self-identity, having a hidden attachment to my amber anger, which I have now disowned, means that there is a hidden amber subject in my orange awareness. A part of my orange self is secretly addicted or identified with an amber impulse. Except this amber impulse is not experienced as a subjective first-person impulse, but as a second or third-person other lurking in my awareness. I can then project it onto others and begin the perpetual dance of shadowboxing, where I accuse others of being angry with me or harboring hostile or malicious intentions toward me. Depending on the actual fulcrum and the severity of the dissociation, attachment to this projected anger can evoke anxiety, fear, or downright paranoia. Everywhere that I go, I am confronted with the same conspiracy, and due to my unconscious attachment to the original emotion, it feels as though this issue is following me around, so I feel I can no longer trust anyone. Or perhaps I become depressed because my sense of okayness and safety are constantly jeopardized by the unwelcoming world, which is really what my rage looks like when I am perceiving it from the outside, when I have disowned it. And if I am feeling that the world has a personal grudge against me, and it's not going to leave me be, this is once again because I am unconsciously attached to the original impulse, and I am actually the one unwilling to let go. As a matter of fact, it is impossible to let go of something if one doesn't first own it or acknowledge it as a part that belongs to them. While transitioning from the differentiation phase to the integration phase, parts of the previous level can be poorly integrated, or worse, completely negated. What results at this point is a repression of the healthy aspects of the previous level. It can be said that the new level of self develops an allergy to lower-level impulses, needs, or capacities. Even worse, oftentimes the entire line is repressed and rejected because of an aversion to integrating a specific level in that line. An example of this is the repression side of the level line fallacy. Let's investigate the cause of this repression. As mentioned earlier, Healthy transformation converts the self of one stage into a tool possessed by the self of the next stage. In the integration phase of the fulcrum, the self is only able to integrate aspects of the lower level that have not already been dissociated at the earlier fulcrum phases. Previously dissociated impulses appear alien and threatening. Therefore, out of a desire for self-preservation, the self further alienates these dissociated impulses, fortifying a boundary that is reactionary or allergic to them at the new stage of development. Additionally, out of a healthy desire to jettison or negate the incompatible functions of the lower stage, the self may also begin to conflate all healthy and unhealthy impulses associated with the lower stage, consequently repressing the lower stage out of a fear of infecting or jeopardizing its newly emerging superior identity. This latter rejection or repression of the lower by the higher is also an example of a dominator holarchy. The most important point is, in either case, repression or allergy happens due to a hidden dissociation. Moreover, the hidden dissociation which leads to allergy at the integration phase is twofold. First, there is a pre-existing dissociation, potentially from earlier fulcrum phases, which makes certain I impulses appear alien, before the integration phase even begins. Second, during the integration phase, the self, due to its desire for preservation, either builds defenses to keep out these seemingly foreign impulses, which appear threatening, or it associates the entire lower level with these impulses and represses the lower level altogether. The very definition of an allergy is an overactive immune response, a preemptive assault and rejection of invading foreign substances, which in this case are pre-existing dissociated or disowned facets of the self that the new self fortifies itself against. In severe cases, the entire capacity or line is associated with an undesirable level and is repressed. As you may have guessed, an example of this happening in the spiritual line is the repression side of the level line fallacy. However, this time, instead of a fixated view of religion that is stuck at amber, we have at our disposal a cold and soulless rationalism, which rejects not just amber's spirit, but spirit in all its manifestations. A possible ironic consequence is that the entire story begins to repeat itself as the self maintains an unconscious attachment to the dissociated amber spiritual identity. Paradoxically, in order to fulfill the need for spirituality, a need completely repressed, but a need to which the self is nonetheless unconsciously attached, the self can display an irrational and fervent adherence or addiction to science, treating scientific materialism as if it were the one true religion. This mythic adherence to scientific materialism is maintained even against the cries of higher reason, because any intrusions by what was originally repressed are inherently threatening to the self's now distorted identification. The irony is painful, as science now begins its religious crusade against spirit. This, of course, is the transparent act of science's shadowboxing of religion. The more severe the allergy is to the healthy aspects of amber mythic religious faith, the more severe is the consequent irrational fixation to science. And no amount of rationalization can get at the original issue, because no science can force us to see what we have preemptively decided is not worth seeing. On a final note, in the lesson on states, you will see that repression and fixation, along with allergies and addictions, apply to state development as well. All right, if you feel like you need 10 years of psychotherapy after the last few slides, we're with you. Go to coreintegral.com, click on the Mentoring tab under Programs, and sign up for a session with Ali Akalin. He is a trained therapist, a scary good integral theory savant, and he wrote this section on pathologies. He is dedicated to helping you resolve any pathologies you have, or any that he has just helped create. Only a few more concepts to go before rounding out this marathon path on levels theory. Next, we return to the question asked earlier. How do we understand individual development in a cumulative or holistic way? Center of gravity, our next topic, demonstrates exactly how that is achieved. Development is complex. That is one thing we can say for sure. With over 24 lines, each with its own set of stages, an accurate individual psychograph is tricky to create and even more cumbersome to communicate. Even with developmental altitude serving as a tool for cross-line communication, we are left with the problem of referring to an individual's development in a cumulative and holistic, but also concise manner. Having to report on the status of our full psychographs every time we speak about our development just doesn't cut it. Fortunately, a concept called center of gravity fits the bill. Center of gravity is another orienting generalization that allows us to summarize an individual's aggregate level of proximate self-development in spite of its complexity and variable nature. Despite our tendency to do so, an individual shouldn't be pegged as being at a single level. With levels existing as probability waves, even at the macro scale, developmental expression is just not precisely located at a single position. However, it is interesting to note that when you know someone quite well, you get a strong sense that their development does seem to hover around a certain stage most of the time. Center of gravity is used to describe this place. More precisely, center of gravity refers to general developmental vicinity of the proximate self in the self-identity line. As such, it is the stage of development around which most other major lines revolve, meaning cognitive development is typically 1/2 to 1 stage higher, and values and moral are about the same, or within a stage or two at most below. Remember, this is another orienting generalization, so it won't appear exactly the same way in every person, but it seems accurate enough in most instances. And it allows us to put a name to the general sense we get about an individual's development. However, please keep in mind that the concept is not yet research validated, and to be most accurate needs to be confined to development at the macro scale. So, if we were to say that your best friend's center of gravity is orange, does this mean every expression they make will come from the orange altitude? Well, not exactly. Our final concept, called developmental range, shows us that your friend's expression will show variance towards higher and lower levels depending on a few variables. As we strive to find ways to explain development in a manner that is both accurate and expeditious, it helps tremendously to supplement center of gravity with the concept of developmental range, which has been research validated, and adds to your potential for accuracy without making the task more difficult. Developmental range describes the span or range of an individual's developmental expression in different contexts, with context being defined, for us, as various configurations of mostly quadrant factors. At the low end of the developmental range is the functional expression. This is a person's typical developmental expression in normal, non-supported, or possibly stressful or non-ideal contexts. In the middle of the range is an optimal expression. This could be considered the relative center of the developmental range, surfacing when the individual is in a typical, non-stressful context where quadrant pressures are either normal or tending toward ideal. Then, at the upper end of the range is the scaffolded expression, which surfaces when the context features support or scaffolding that makes a more complex expression easier to embody. This support typically takes the form of another person who is aiding us in some way, either through direct assistance or through implicit presence and subtle positive pressure. The result is a push or pull from our optimal expression towards an emergent capacity which we haven't ourselves fully stabilized or integrated into our approximate self. One final point on developmental range and a quick example before we conclude this learning path. First, developmental range has been research validated at the micro and meso developmental scales. At the macro scale, and for our purposes, it will serve again as an orienting generalization, helping us to further grasp both the fluid nature of development and the effects that context has on our developmental expression. To take this one step deeper, consider the following example. Say your center of gravity is orange, and you are beginning to differentiate from that as the next higher structure of green begins to emerge as a true potential. Your typical or optimal expression in most situations and contexts, where you aren't stressed or otherwise inhibited, comes from the orange level. Consider a typical day. You slept well, nothing crazy is going on at work, no fights with your partner, your kids and pets are behaving, and you aren't encountering anything too challenging. But if you hadn't slept, were getting ill, or were stressed about work because of a difficult meeting, your developmental expression could dip down to early orange. Alternately, in an ideal context, say you were feeling great, were full of clarity, and were having your problem-solving skills directly supported by someone with a higher center of gravity, your developmental expression could easily embody a green altitude, which, remember, is beginning to emerge as a capacity, but is not yet a fully integrated part of yourself. Again, our central point about these two concepts, center of gravity and developmental range, is that they aim to help you more fully grasp the dynamic and flowing nature of development, while providing you a way to refer to an individual's development in a summative but still accurate manner. With many lines and constantly shifting quadrant contexts, it will cause you trouble if you think that someone is always and solidly at one particular level. But in lieu of always needing to keep an entire integral psychograph in mind, these concepts allow us to conceive of individual development in a more concise way. All right, you made it through the longest theory learning path in this entire course. Nice work. We've covered a huge amount of information on a variety of topics from holons to altitude to center of gravity. As we bring this in for a landing and prepare to shift to awareness and application of levels, let's conclude by distilling this learning into the key principles and properties of individual development. Development is the movement from less complex holons, or whole parts, to more complex holons in what are called nested holarchies. Each new level in these holarchies transcends the previous level by adding a novel emergent capacity, while simultaneously including capacities from the previous level, if, that is, we are talking about an enduring structure. Individual holons have the 4 quadrants as dimensions of their being, and social holons consist of their individual holons as members along with their shared lower left and lower right quadrant intersections. All types of holons can be viewed through a quadrivia. Individual holons come together in individual holarchies, and social holons in social holarchies. These two types of holarchies don't get mixed or stacked on top of each other because they exist in upper and lower dimensions of the tetra-evolving, tetra-arising quadrants. Speaking of the quadrants, levels tetra emerge in lines in all quadrants. Speaking of levels, they go by many names. Stages, referring to their unidirectional sequence of unfolding, structures, referring to their dynamic, holistic patterns, and waves, referring to their fluid nature as probability waves rather than rigid developmental rungs. There are 2 types of structures, enduring and transitional. The former moves forward in development, and the latter is replaced. Each possess deep and surface features. Deep features are almost universal features of structures shared by many holons. Surface features vary holon to holon, and from culture to culture, and so on. Transformation refers to a vertical movement to higher levels. Translation refers to the process of integrating all aqual dynamics at any given level, and regression is the de-evolution to lower levels. The process of transformation renders the subject of one level the object of the subject of the next higher level. Altitude is a useful model for understanding the development of consciousness and complexity across all lines. It is an essential tool for understanding development at the macro scale, which tracks growth over months and years. The self is the navigator or climber of the ladder of development. At each rung, the climber has a different view. As development unfolds, the view is replaced but the rung is included. During each transition or fulcrum, the proximate self navigates 3 phases: identification to differentiation to integration. Center of gravity and developmental range are used to summarize and simplify conceptions about individuals' development, while not foregoing the fluid and imprecise nature of developmental expression. Center of gravity is the general level of proximate self-development in the self-identity line, and developmental range spans functional, optimal, and scaffolded expressions depending on quadrant factors. Finally, the majority of this review and this learning path in general has focused on ontogenetic development, which is the unfolding of the individual through the spectrum we've described. In ontogenetic development, everyone starts at square one or infrared and has the potential to develop to higher waves. The existence of these waves is made possible by phylogenetic development, which in this case refers to the development of the human species. In the past, each of the first-tier altitudes emerged and were laid down as ever-deepening cosmic grooves, or patterns through which future individuals progress with greater ease. Ontogenetic development is therefore said to recapitulate phylogenetic development. To take this one step further, as each of us continue to deepen the grooves of second and third-tier waves, our children's children's children will hopefully have an easier time progressing to the highest of the waves available at this time, meaning at some point, second tier will begin to emerge when kids enter high school, whereas currently, most adults haven't developed that far along the spectrum. So, if that doesn't make you feel a bit more responsible for cultivating your own growth, we don't know what will. Not bad for a summary of all that we've covered, huh? How is this landing for you? Make sense? A bit overwhelming, perhaps? If so, don't worry. The levels component of AQUIL is a broad and nuanced area of the integral approach, which can take some time to fully wrap your head and heart around. Remember, you can come back to this learning path whenever you need to. Or, even better, if you haven't already done so, you can move on to engage the application and awareness learning paths. Because, once again, theory is not enough. Understanding levels conceptually is just the beginning. The initial steps on the path towards truly expanding your capacity for growth and truly deepening your ability to realize all the benefits of a developmentally informed view. These benefits, from accelerating your own growth, to recognizing and supporting growth in others, to leveraging levels to aid in more skillful and compassionate communication, which takes into account the variance in needs, beliefs, and values. All of this is earned through a recursive process of understanding levels so that you can recognize and apply them. And attempting to recognize and apply them is the best way of refining your theoretical understanding.
Just as with the other elements of AQUIL, the levels component can be applied as a powerful tool to gain greater understanding of how and why people behave, speak, and feel in the ways that they do. In particular, it's supremely useful in analyzing the nature of effective communication. However, unlike many of the other elements, the explanatory power of levels carries with it a degree of risk. Risk, you might ask, what do we mean by that? Well, think of it this way. Given your theoretical knowledge of levels and your recognition that levels reveal vastly different cognitive abilities, different self-identities, and different values, what's the first thing that comes to mind as you consider what they might be good for in application? Typically, the answer is making sense of other people's development. Perhaps even for answering the question, how developed are the people around me, those I live and work with, my friends, my family, my partner, my boss? And herein lies the risk. As we've seen, development is a very complex and nuanced affair. As such, assessing other people's development is typically quite inaccurate. What do we use as data? What people say? What they do? How they think? And what do we access to make sense of that data? How do we measure it, if you will, and what does it reveal to us? To say the least, the process is complex, and even more so because the act of seeing is a real process of inferential excavation, and it's even more complex than, say, just your feeling of current values, beliefs, and self-sense. This is why developmental scientists create, research, test, and validate developmental assessments, because our ad hoc assessments aren't that reliable. But there's no denying that we make our own assessments anyway. And that isn't necessarily a problem as long as we account for the fact that our assessments have a high margin of error. We use them for our best purposes, and we commit to training our ability to recognize levels. Our assessments of others can prove beneficial if 1. It's a means toward a greater goal rather than a goal itself, and 2. We hold the accuracy of our assessments lightly. So, what is a possible greater goal that using levels as an analysis tool can help you attain? Well, with individuals, a levels analysis can help you understand why and how people believe, say, and do such wildly different things. And most importantly, it can help you cultivate more compassion for the wide range of human developmental expressions. It increases your capacity to understand, honor, and communicate with those people at different levels, higher or lower. Towards these aims, this learning path will offer an activity that trains your ability to recognize levels, not in specific individuals, but in the communications that individuals create. A single act of communication is an unreliable data source for determining the level of development of a communicator, but even the smallest act of communication is attempting to evoke resonance in the receiver of that communication. So, in a moment, we'll offer an activity that presents you with various examples of cultural communication, branding, marketing, advertising, position statements, and such, and you'll be asked to identify, using your understanding of levels, what stage or stages of development are being spoken to in each communication. The aim here is to recognize that language in communication isn't separate from development, meaning different levels use language in different ways. And more importantly, different language will produce resonance or understanding in individuals at different levels. We've presented this activity in this manner for 2 reasons. First, it gets us away from using a small amount of communication as enough data to assess a specific individual's development. And second, it isolates and trains in an active way the recognition of levels being spoken to, which is an act you naturally engage in with great regularity, whether in marketing or in everyday conversations. Just for fun, we'll do this in the style of a learning game. You'll be presented with 12 examples of communication, ranging from short to long, and from simple advertisements to vision statements. Each will be presented without audio, so you can take your time to read or view them at your own pace. Consider each selection carefully, noting as you go what altitude is being lit up in resonance. It might be helpful to write them down as you go along. Then, take a second, more analytical pass and ask not what is being lit up in you, but what level is being spoken to by the people who created the communication. With these 2 passes, one more first person and the other more third person, you should find it easier to identify the altitudes being spoken to in each example. Mark each level that you feel is in play. Many times more than one will be present, and then click Submit to proceed to the next question. Again, this is set up like a quiz, mostly for fun, but also to gauge your facility in this skill set. With that said, hold the quiz aspect of it lightly. This skill, like most areas of AQUIL application, take time to master. Oh, and be sure to review your answers once you complete the activity. So what's the first thing you notice in reflection on that exercise? Development is not a clear-cut affair, right? This is to suggest that even when specific individuals are not the objects of our developmental assessments, conjuring a particular, confident, and defined sense of when one level is being activated versus another is not as easy as it first may appear. Truthfully, though, communications like this don't typically convey clear communications to only one level. In the majority of the communications included, multiple levels were being spoken to or otherwise activated, making this, in some sense, an analog to recognizing development in individuals you come across daily. Now, just to be clear, this is not a precise association. It's not to imply that individuals exist at multiple levels at once. The concepts of center of gravity and developmental range, as explained in the learning path on theory, still apply. But it is suggesting that depending on the data we use to derive our developmental assessment of individuals, they may present ranges of expression which are difficult to locate at a certain center of gravity. It in some ways suggests that when assessing individuals, we also need to parse out the levels they're speaking to and the center of gravity they're speaking from. This is even more complicated at higher levels of development when an understanding and awareness of development earns people greater facility to appeal to different levels at will. But that's getting slightly ahead of ourselves. Before going there, let's reflect more deeply on your experience of this exercise. In general, what was your experience? Was it challenging? If so, in what ways specifically? Was it difficult to associate what you were reading with what you've learned about development? What were you taking as your cues? Did you find yourself more so guided by the choice of words, concepts, and ideas in each communication, or by a sense of your past developmental history, which may have helped you to sense that one of the communications would have appealed to you directly at some point in your past? Or was it a combination of the two? Either way, you probably noticed that the content of language, our primary path data source about developmental expression, is an imprecise cue at times. Why might this be? First, specific concepts need to be understood in the context of their presentation, and with different contexts, you get different meanings, which would resonate with different levels. Second, even when considering context, there's an interpretive element brought to the table by the receivers of these communications. This suggests that concepts do not necessarily resonate with the levels that you might expect. Again, the point here is that recognizing development is imprecise. It takes practice, a bit of trial and error, as well as continual refinement and adjustment of your methods of interpretation. Finally, this exercise points to another skill to be cultivated from your developing ability to recognize levels, one which may not have been at play in the majority of people who created the communications we've looked at. Each of these communications is an artifact produced by an individual or a social holon. It's difficult for us to know, but chances are that many of the creators did not have an explicit understanding of development. Therefore, they were left to create a message that appealed to groups defined in other ways, probably using demographics, psychographics, and such, or they were just communicating what was most true or important to them, hoping that it evoked resonance in their audience. But at post-teal altitudes, after you've developed the ability to honor the importance of each level, and after you couple that ability with an in-depth knowledge of each altitude, you can consciously choose to craft your communications to produce the most resonance in your audience. Obviously, this has profound benefits in the realm of marketing, advertising, and public relations when audience reaction is tied to important business outcomes. But on a more personal level, this skill is at the heart of authentic communication and compassionate, skillful means. Skillful means is defined in various ways, but for our purposes, let's consider it to be the act of consciously choosing to invest energy into cultivating resonance in interaction by meeting somebody where they are, developmentally speaking, and by only speaking to them at a half level higher where you think their center of gravity resides, given, of course, that it's the right context and situation to do so. This very skill in the hands of integral practitioners makes possible compassionate service to a vast range of individuals, the entire spiral, in fact, which is why it's so oftentimes called a prime directive of integral practice. It's an integral obligation, in so many ways, to deeply understand and experience others where they are and meet them there before considering taking them beyond their current developmental range. So, if meeting people where they are in any given moment is the primary element of skillful means and authentic communication, it seems to necessitate developmental assessment to some degree. And that is exactly what we were previously offering cautionary notes about. Yes, it certainly does, but remember, if we're attempting to serve a broader goal, one that's beyond merely assigning a level to someone, if we're seeking to find out exactly how to communicate with them in a way that serves them, then our assessments of others prove quite necessary. Skillful means necessitates the ability to distinguish not what level is being spoken to, as we've explored here, but between higher and lower levels of development in individual expressions. The key to recognizing individual development is built on the awareness of lesser or greater complexity. Why this might appear similar to what you just did in this activity, and in a way it is, it's also distinct enough to warrant an exploration of this skill in the learning path on awareness. If you've not already engaged in that path, you're invited to do so at this time. What you'll discover is, again, the important interrelationship between theory, application or analysis, and awareness of the theoretical distinctions arising in and around us.
As you have most likely noticed, both in this course and in your life until this point, levels of development are alive in you. And even more than that, they have literally ushered you from birth to the integrated and beautiful individual that you call yourself today. But recognizing levels arising in self and others is difficult. Consider the thoughts, feelings, and emotions arising for you in this very moment. Do they appear as orange thoughts, green thoughts, or teal thoughts? No, they don't show up as coming from a level. They just arise as thoughts, emotions, and feelings. Recognizing your own developmental level, while not impossible, is not as fruitful of an exercise as recognizing the higher and lower complexity present in the expressions of other people. In this learning path, we will experiment with refining your awareness of higher and lower complexity in others. We could give you a few questions, ask you to answer them, and then guide you through a developmental assessment of your own responses. But that won't give you a very broad picture of development, as you would just encounter your own center of gravity. Instead, we will engage in an awareness exercise that challenges you to recognize the essential patterns of many structures of consciousness, and to gauge them in relation to each other, as you attempt to parse higher structures from lower structures. While it might seem more exciting to figure out your own development, a more in-depth tour of the development of others will actually train your ability to self-assess in a more rapid and effective way. And it connects back directly to the skills needed to engage in the skillful means mentioned at the end of the application learning path. As we spoke about early in this lesson, your sense of development in self and others is based on an intuition that's fueled by your awareness and knowledge of development. Your developmental intuition, no matter how refined, will never be as accurate as a true assessment, but it is certainly easier to deploy, available to you whenever it is needed. Given the nature of this investigation, a simple question arises: can we actually refine our developmental intuition? While it will never be as accurate, nor a replacement for developmental assessment, we can indeed actively train our intuition, honing its accuracy and ability to parse even finely nuanced differences in development. By leveraging your knowledge of development and exercising your ability to actively recognize these distinctions, we can up-level the quality of your intuition. Earlier, we asked which of the two explanations of gravity were more appropriate for a child, and you were easily able to distinguish between the greater complexity of the second option, which was obviously suited for adults, and the simplicity of the first one, which was more appropriate for a child's level of understanding. But what if we looked at 5 statements, each falling within a stage or two of each other, an analog perhaps to the different expressions we find in educated adults? It would be harder to distinguish higher and lower in that case, right? Well, this is exactly the aim of this learning path and the activity you are about to engage. Once finished, we will take a look at exactly how we generate our developmental recognitions. Again, we're going to do this as a learning quiz of sorts, just so that you can get accurate feedback about your efforts. We will go through several questions that provide you with a series of statements. Your goal is to drag and drop those statements into an accurate developmental progression from lower to higher. We will start out easy, with what are hopefully clear distinctions, and then we will move to more complex statements with similar content and less range between the highest and lowest expression. You will need a journal and something to write with, so that you can record your rankings before inputting them as answers in the learning quiz. In reflection, how did that activity land for you? A bit easier at the start than towards the end, huh? That was intentional and done for a few reasons. First, simply to provide a bit of a challenge. And second, to demonstrate the complexity of recognizing nuanced developmental differences in adults. Did you also notice how the skills being exercised here, while still working with levels, were of a subtly different nature than those needed to recognize what levels are being spoken to in communication, as you saw in the application learning path? Here, particularly in the later questions, the altitude of each statement wasn't enough to determine higher and lower, showing that developmental expression is more of a continuum rather than easily isolated into discrete groups or levels. So, given this, how did you come to the determinations you made? What did you use as your primary source of information? Think back to the questions and ask yourself, what cues did you take? What data were you looking for to help you assign a ranking? Did you rely on content like the topics, ideas, vocabulary? If so, did you notice how that became more difficult as you progressed to the more complex questions? When making development rankings like this, we rely on several categories of data to make our determinations. First is topical content. What topics and ideas were present in the content? Was the statement concerning fairness and justice, or was it concerning desires and wants? The former is usually higher than the latter. Second is length and elaboration. Was more stuff said with greater explanation in one statement as compared to another? Third is vocabulary and grammar. What words were used, and how were they arranged grammatically? Were there syntactical complexities and variations within a single statement, or were the statements composed with simple words? Fourth is meaning. What was the intended meaning of the statements? Setting aside how exactly the statements were made, were the intended meanings about more or less complex ideas, beliefs, and concepts? Fifth is structure. Were the ideas organized differently, some with more complexity than the others? Here, the use of connecting words such as but, so, and therefore are great cues into the structural complexity. More connections linking more ideas to one another show that individuals are attempting to create relationships between different ideas, rather than just listing ideas one by one. Sixth is the degree of abstraction. What was the degree of abstraction present in the content? Was the speaker able to express a perspective that was beyond the concrete representational aspects of whatever they were speaking about? And if so, to what degree? For example, world peace is a lower-order abstraction than transnational world peace, and not just because the latter has more words. It's actually a more abstract concept, taking more explanation to unpack its meaning. This is just a partial list, but it covers a large extent of the data we use to make developmental assessments. Each of these come together with your sense of levels as discrete rungs to help you parse higher and lower expressions from each other. While each of these are valid sources, there are also some differences. Ranking determined by content, relying on topics, vocabulary, and meaning alone, are best suited for macro-level differentiations and work well when the content is different, when one statement is about revenge and the other about communication, for example. Content will almost always be our first cue, but when the stage range between statements is small, or the topic is similar, content isn't always enough. A mixture of elaboration, structure, and degree of abstractness can help you make more fine-tuned determinations, or at the very least, they are great supplements to content-based data. Sometimes, if you limit yourself to only content, you can slip into working with levels too much like stereotypes. Competition, regardless of how and in what context it is used, is always orange, and communication and togetherness is always green, for example. For now, the main takeaway is to do your best to track what data you are using to make these assessments, and to attempt to supplement your content considerations with other variables, such as structure and abstractness. In Course 2, we will explore these elements in far greater depth. No matter how you slice it, development is a complex affair. The developmental expressions of individuals will rarely conform nicely to the distinctions we've learned here, and those expressions are always affected by the quadrant pressures arising in the moment. This is particularly true when working with adults, where developmental differences are more nuanced and sometimes harder to spot. But regardless of that complexity, you can choose to use simple or complex data for assessment, depending on your aims. Yes, structure and abstractness, while harder to track, are more accurate than content alone. But it doesn't make assessments based on content alone wrong or inherently bad. As you continue to recognize developmental complexity as present in the expressions of self and other, we recommend you aim to first, become aware of how you are arriving at your assessment. Second, over time, continue working toward more accurate methods. And third, consider your aims or goals. What are you after? How are you using your assessments? What methods best support those aims? Maybe your aims are so critical, so important, and your need for accuracy so high that you should set aside your intuition and have folks take research-validated developmental assessments instead. This, of course, is a call you can make depending on your situation. If you are trying to get to know someone better, so that you can communicate with them, informal assessments, like the ones we are doing here, are more than adequate. But if you're a consultant attempting to guide a reorganization with developmental data taken into account, assessments should be handled by validated measurement instruments. If you are interested in the validated assessments, we recommend the Developmental Testing Service, or DTS. You can learn more about their offerings at devtestservice.com.
Levels of development are qualitatively distinct patterns of dynamic emergence found in all developmental lines and in every quadrant. They're crucial to understanding the universal commonality to all living things, namely that everything from oak trees to humans develop through stages or levels towards more complex and emergent forms. These patterns of development, while oftentimes different on the surface, share many deep commonalities, from their transcend and include pattern to their arrangement in holarchies. Deciphering these developmental patterns, first through understanding and then through awareness and application, is a key component of actualizing the integral vision in your life. In this lesson on levels, we explored one of the most complex and nuanced topics in this course. We looked at the concept of holons, and we saw that as they develop, they do so in nested holarchies. We also learned about developmental altitude, a useful tool for understanding and communicating about human development in various lines. And we learned about center of gravity and developmental range, both of which help you refer to individuals' levels of development succinctly and without losing an ability to account for the variance between individuals. Each of these aim to refine your pre-existing intuition of development, to up-level it in several ways so that when you look at self and other through the lens of levels, the results are more accurate and more compassionate. Finally, you've witnessed firsthand the interpenetration of developmental theory, an application of levels to communication, and the process of distinguishing lesser and greater complexity in individuals. As you proceed from here, keep in mind that venturing more so in one of these directions over others will ultimately diminish or render less effective your ability to skillfully and compassionately use levels as an active vehicle for growth and transcendence. Next, we've compiled another interactive review of the theoretical distinctions covered in this lesson. View it now if you'd like, and remember to come back to it whenever it's needed. Levels are qualitatively distinct degrees of organization that have enduring holistic patterns of whole partness and which are fluid, not rigidly separated, and unfold in a sequence as nested holarchies. Levels refer to the different qualitatively distinct degrees of organization. Stages refer to their unidirectional sequence of unfolding. Structures refer to levels as dynamic holistic patterns. Waves refer to their flowing nature as probability waves rather than rigid developmental rungs. Levels occur in all lines. The number of levels is somewhat arbitrary and depends on the research conducted. Any number is fine as long as the entire spectrum that is emerged at this time is covered. Typically, 8 to 12 levels offers an ideal degree of specificity. Levels also occur in all quadrants. They tetra-arise and tetra-evolve. Levels in one quadrant tetra-emerge with levels of identical complexity in the other quadrants. Holons are entities which are wholes that are parts of larger wholes, or whole parts. For example, molecules are wholes that include atoms and are themselves parts of cells. There are 4 kinds of whole part relationships. The individual and social types are self-organizing. An individual holon has 4 quadrants arising as dimensions of its being in the world. They have a dominant monad or central eye, like a human or an ape. A social holon is comprised of its members plus their lower quadrant intersections or dominant mode of resonance. For example, a family or a flock of geese. Artifacts are anything produced by individual or social holons, like a car or a mathematical equation. Heaps are wholes which are random conglomerations of stuff that show no complex ordering, such as a pile of sand or a garbage dump. Holarchies are nested hierarchies of holons, where each higher or more complex level transcends and includes the previous level. Holarchies are nested hierarchies of holons, where every successive level transcends and includes its predecessor. Individual holons create individual holarchies, and social holons, social holarchies. The 2 are not combined or stacked on each other. Rather, they coexist in the upper and lower quadrants. Actualization holarchies are natural holarchies which seek to maximize a holon's developmental potential. Dominator holarchies, typically created by humans, seek to oppress lower levels by rendering them as just parts rather than whole parts. Fallacies are prevalent but insidious mistakes that can be made when working with levels or lines. Their occurrence is often unseen, but their effects can be quite confounding. The pre-trans fallacy is the confusion of lower or pre-conventional levels with higher or post-conventional levels because both are non-conventional. It occurs in 2 manners, both which stem from the same confusion but go in different directions. Elevationism raises pre-conventional to post-conventional, and reductionism lowers post-conventional to pre-conventional. The level line fallacy occurs when one level in a line is confused with the line itself. This leads to either fixation or repression of the particular line and the freezing or stalling of development at that level in question. Altitude is an orienting generalization that postulates content-free levels of consciousness or complexity. It allows for easy cross-line communication and understanding. First-tier altitudes from infrared to green represent the most distinguishable grooves in human development, culturally the last of which emerged in the mid-20th century. In general, individuals developed to first-tier altitudes fight for the rightness and exclusive value of their worldview. Second-tier altitudes are newly emergent, representing less than 5% of the population. At this time, two altitudes make up the second tier, and both of which represent a radical reorganization or momentous leap in consciousness and complexity. Also, they are the first altitudes to recognize, honor, and include the valid perspectives of all previous levels of development. Third-tier altitudes are the shallowest cosmic grooves. They represent the highest emergent structural capacities of a truly transpersonal space, characterized by increasing transcendence of the ego. Structures are dynamic holistic patterns of development that emerge over time and get carved into the cosmos as grooves for others to follow. Enduring structures are those aspects which are included in subsequent development, and transitional structures are transcended and replaced. The capacity to form mental images and symbols are enduring cognitive structures, but pre-conventional morality is transitional. Once you reach conventional waves, pre-conventional is not needed and therefore not carried forward. Each structure has both deep and surface features. Deep features are almost universal and are shared by many holons in a given group. Surface structures are variable and change depending on a number of variables, such as culture. A deep feature of language development is the use of pronouns, and the surface features are the specific types of pronouns and the way they are used. At all scales of developmental investigation, three broad movements are possible, but these movements look and function very differently depending on that scale. We will explore how they show up at the macro-developmental scale. Transformation is the process of moving vertically from one structure to the next higher structure. It renders the subject of one level the object of the subject at the next level. Translation is the process of integrating and balancing the aqual dynamics present at a given level. In a broad sense, it's the movement of making sense of your quadrants, lines, states, and types at your current structure. Regression is the temporary or permanent movement from a higher level to a lower level. When tracking developmental changes in years with a macro scale, regression is quite rare, happening, for example, in cases of physiological damage, where upper right structures supporting more complex upper left functioning are damaged. Research about human development is conducted at several different scales, with each showing different properties and dynamics. The macro scale tracks developmental changes as moving through broad stages over the span of many months and years. Developmental altitude, as discussed here, is a macro scale concept. The mesoscale tracks developmental movement over the span of days to weeks to months. Here, translation is messy, regression more common, and mini transformation within stages quite common. The microscale tracks development and learning at a scale of minutes to hours. Primarily used by researchers investigating development through a dynamic systems lens, the microscale requires a fine-grained developmental spectrum in order to track the constant transformative, translative, and regressive movements. The self-system or self-sense is the navigator of transformation and translation as the self proceeds through the general spectrum of individual development. The self is the locus of several important functions, including identification, will, defenses, metabolism, and integration. Each of these work mostly behind the scene to constitute and reconstitute your self's identity and functioning. The self has three aspects or components: the proximate self, or what you call I; the distal self, or what you take as an object or call me or mine; and the anterior self, or witness, which sees all phenomena arise through the eyes of the one true self. A useful metaphor for understanding the development of self is ladder-climber view. The self is the navigator or climber of the developmental ladder. As the self ascends to each higher rung or structure, the enduring aspects of the previous rung are preserved, while the exclusive view from the previous rung is negated or left behind. The self navigates what are called fulcrums as it moves from rung to rung on the developmental ladder. Each fulcrum is comprised of three phases: identification, differentiation, and integration. The self starts out subject to a given level. This is called fusion or identification. As the view from that level begins to break down, the self differentiates or disidentifies from the current level and shifts identification to the next higher level. Finally, from the place of the new level, the self integrates the previous level's enduring capacities while negating any transitional aspects. Center of gravity is the level of proximate self-development in the self-identity line. It's the place around which development in other lines typically gravitates. It's typically in accord with the general sense we get of someone's overall development. At any point in the developmental journey, the self's movement between structures can result in the emergence of shadows or pathologies. In a very general sense, shadow forms when a threatening or undesirable, positive or negative, impulse, feeling, or quality is disowned. Once this happens, these qualities start to appear as second-person or even third-person events in your first-person awareness. Pushing these aspects away doesn't actually get rid of them, but simply converts them into painful neurotic symptoms or shadows that come back to haunt you. Shadows can also be understood as little sub-I's or parts of yourself which never differentiated and therefore still remain subject to the views from earlier transitional structures. These sub-I's are left running around in the basement of your psyche until they are re-owned or reintegrated. Pathologies can also emerge at the identification, differentiation, or integration phases of each fulcrum. Two general pathologies result: allergies, or repression of previous stages, or capacities or addictions, which are fixations or obsessions with a current, past, or emerging stage. Developmental range describes the fluctuations in developmental expression as the context of expression and performance change. Functional is the lower end of the spectrum and is a performance in normal, non-supported, or possibly stressful or non-ideal contexts. Optimal could be considered the relative center of the developmental range, surfacing when the individual is in a typical non-stressful context where quadrant pressures are either normal or tending toward ideal. Scaffolded is the upper end of the developmental range. It surfaces when the context features support that makes a more complex expression easier to embody. Support is typically provided by another person and can be either explicit or implicit. As you take your awareness of levels out into the world, you'll find that the concept of levels applies to levels themselves. Meaning, you guessed it, there are levels of development in your understanding of levels. From one perspective, this isn't too surprising, right? Like everything we learn, our understanding, ability to apply and to recognize levels, as well as other components of AQUIL, starts out less complex and can develop into great complexity. Integral researchers are just starting to understand these developmental levels in the learning of levels, but it's quite clear that some real developmental action is at play. So why are we bringing this up? Good question. Levels are powerful, both in their explanatory power and in their power to upset people if used inappropriately or in a manner that others don't really understand. If you tell people that they have 4 dimensions to their being, they typically smile and think, yeah, that sounds about right. But if you tell them they are green, or even worse, if they hear you said it behind their back, it's often quite a different story. In general, people struggle with being labeled, and some straight up rebel against the idea of ranking, seeing it as marginalizing and oppressive. In our experience, many people get quite excited when they first experience the power of levels as a tool, so much so that some take this new hammer out into a world that strangely appears like a bunch of nails, and then they start whacking their way from nail to nail with their new developmentally informed hammer. Sure, this is a bit of hyperbole, but not really. The important point here is that whatever the complexity of your understanding, it's critical to keep in mind the true benefit of levels. They help you understand the differences between individual expressions, and they aid you in understanding the ways in which we're all similar, meaning we all develop, and we just happen to be at different places along that journey. Levels can also help us communicate better with others, and ultimately, they're a very effective path to cultivating more compassion for other human beings, regardless of how high or low their development appears to be. Nice work! You've come to the end of the longest lesson in this course. Feel free to take a break and soak all of this in. If you want, come back a few days from now and take the lesson again. When you're ready, our journey continues. From here, we turn to the next element of the integral approach called states, yet another beautiful aspect of your own awareness and experience. And even more exciting, we'll encounter another developmental spectrum, this time not through structures of vertical transformation, but through states of horizontal unfolding.